I'd lived at Whispering Pines Estates for 11 months when the HOA fined me $2,400 for a dog-run fence that was already sitting in my backyard the day I closed on the house. I paid the county records office $11 for a copy of the original permit, expecting a quiet, boring correction. What I found instead, buried in 3 years of HOA financial disclosures nobody had ever bothered to actually read, was a management company quietly draining the community's reserve fund, a board president covering for her own brother-in-law, and a plan already in motion to sell 40 acres of shared common land to a shell company neither of them wanted anyone asking about. By the time I was done, I hadn't just gotten my fine reversed. I'd gotten the whole board recalled and the land sale voided by a judge. My name's Diane Castellano. I'm 62, spent 31 years as a public librarian before I retired, and I moved to Whispering Pines Estates 2 years ago, about 8 months after my husband Robert passed, mostly because I wanted a smaller place, with less yard to manage, and a little more community around me than the house we'd raised our kids in ever offered. My son Peter, a CPA who lives about 90 minutes away, helped me go through the closing paperwork, and neither of us thought twice about the community's HOA disclosures, beyond the standard glance any buyer gives them. Dues, architectural guidelines, the usual boilerplate about paint colors and trash can placement. Whispering Pines is a mid-sized gated community, about 310 homes built out over 4 phases between the late 90s and the mid-2010s, anchored by a clubhouse, a community pool, and, this detail matters more than almost anything else in this story, a 40-acre parcel of undeveloped common land at the back of the community, called Meadowbrook Commons, deeded to the homeowners association itself when the developer finished the final phase, preserved in the governing documents as permanent green space for the recreational use and enjoyment of all members in perpetuity. The original developer, according to a framed community history display that still hangs in the clubhouse lobby, had actually planned to build a 5th phase of 40 additional homes on that exact parcel before the housing downturn in the late 2000s stalled the project permanently, leaving the land undeveloped long enough that the developer, rather than continuing to pay carrying costs and property taxes on an entitlement it no longer intended to use, simply deeded the acreage to the association outright as a closing condition on the final phase, a fairly common outcome for stalled development parcels that ends up, more often than most homeowners realize, creating exactly the kind of large, quietly valuable common area that later boards or management companies sometimes eye as an asset to be monetized, rather than land to be preserved. I hadn't known any of that history until Arthur Kim mentioned it to me one afternoon, adding, almost as a throwaway comment I didn't fully appreciate at the time, that there's always been somebody at some point who's floated the idea of selling off part of that parcel. It just never went anywhere before now. I'd walked that land probably 24 times in my first year here, mostly with my neighbor's dog while she recovered from a hip surgery, and never once thought about who actually held the deed to it or what in perpetuity was actually worth on paper, if nobody ever tested it. I should say a little more about why I chose Whispering Pines specifically, because it matters for understanding how invested I eventually became in a fight I never expected to have. Robert and I had talked, in his last 2 years, about downsizing together once he retired from his own career teaching high school chemistry. The two of us picturing a smaller place with a porch and neighbors close enough to actually know by name. The kind of community we'd never quite had time to build in the busy decades of raising Peter and his sister, while both of us worked full-time. Robert never got to make that move with me. The cancer took him 8 months before I finally signed the papers on the house alone, and I remember standing in the empty living room on closing day, thinking that whatever came next, I wanted it to actually feel like the community we'd planned on together, not just a transaction I'd completed by myself out of necessity. That's a strange thing to carry into a dispute over a dog-run fence, I realize, but it's the truth of why I didn't just pay the $2,400 and move on the way plenty of reasonable people would have. I wasn't going to let my first real conflict in this new chapter of my life be one where I simply rolled over because it seemed easier. The HOA itself is run by a 5-member volunteer board, elected by the membership, which in turn contracts with a professional management company to handle day-to-day administration, collecting dues, enforcing architectural rules, managing vendor contracts for landscaping and pool maintenance, that sort of thing. Ours had been managed for the past 6 years by a firm called Summit Ridge Community Management, run by a man named Roland Prescott, who I'd met exactly once at a homeowners meeting, and who struck me, at the time, as competent enough in the bland, forgettable way most vendor relationships tend to be, until something goes wrong with them. The board president, when I moved in, was a woman named Brenda Wexford, who'd served on the board for going on 9 years by that point, longer than anyone else, and who ran meetings with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd clearly stopped being challenged on much of anything a long time ago. I didn't know when I first sat in the back row of my first annual meeting nodding along to budget approvals I didn't fully understand, that Brenda Wexford and Roland Prescott were related by marriage, or that the arrangement between the board she led and the company he ran had, over 9 years, quietly become something closer to a shared enterprise than an arm's-length vendor relationship. I found that out the way I found out almost everything in this story. By refusing to just pay a fine I knew wasn't mine to pay. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, on Summit Ridge Community Management letterhead, citing me for an unapproved architectural modification, specifically a 4-foot wood dog run fence along the side yard of my house, and assessing a $2,400 fine, broken down as a $200 base violation plus $2,200 in accumulated daily penalties the letter claimed had been accruing since the violation was first identified 11 months ago, which happened to be almost exactly when I'd closed on the house. I want to be precise about the timeline here, because precision is what ended up unraveling everything. I didn't build that dog run. It was already standing, weathered and clearly established, the day my real estate agent walked me through the property before closing, and it appears, plainly, in the listing photos from 4 months before that, meaning it had existed under the previous owner's tenure, not mine. I called Summit Ridge's office the same afternoon the letter arrived, and spoke with a young administrative assistant who told me, politely but firmly, that the violation notice showed the fine attached to the current owner of record, regardless of who'd originally built the structure, and that I'd need to either pay it or request a hearing before the board. Peter, when I called him that same evening, asked the practical question first, the way accountants tend to, "Mom, do you actually need the $2,400, or is this about principle at this point?" I told him honestly it was mostly principle, that I could afford to simply pay it without any real hardship, but that something about the letter's confident, almost automatic tone, the way it treated an 11-month-old fine as though it were an established, unquestionable fact, rather than a claim that ought to be checked, bothered me more than the actual dollar amount ever could. Peter didn't try to talk me out of it, which I appreciated, though he did say, half joking, that 31 years of helping library patrons track down obscure records had probably prepared me better for this particular fight than most of his own accounting clients would have been. I requested the hearing, and in the meantime, I drove to the county records office and paid $11 for a certified copy of the property's permit history. It confirmed exactly what I already knew. The dog run fence had been permitted by the previous owner 6 years earlier, long before I ever saw the property, meaning whatever architectural violation existed, if any, predated my ownership entirely by half a decade. I also requested, under the state's Common Interest Community Act, which gives every HOA member the right to inspect the association's official records including violation logs and correspondence, a copy of the association's file on my property's alleged violation. The clubhouse conference room at Whispering Pines is a small, fluorescent-lit space, just off the main event hall, furnished with a folding table and a dozen mismatched chairs that always struck me, on the few occasions I'd been in there before, as an odd setting for decisions that could cost a homeowner thousands of dollars. I brought a manila folder with the permit copy, the listing photos I'd printed at the library on my way over out of old habit, and a single typed page laying out the timeline in plain, numbered steps, the same way I used to organize a research request for a patron, back when I still worked the reference desk. Brenda Wexford chaired the hearing herself, 3 weeks later, in the clubhouse's small conference room, flanked by 2 other board members who said almost nothing the entire time. One of them, a heavy-set man named Phil Garrity, who I later learned rarely missed a meeting, but almost never spoke during one, spent most of the hearing looking at his phone under the table, glancing up only when Brenda's voice sharpened enough to signal something worth paying attention to. The other, a younger woman named Sandra Whitfield who joined the board only the year before, actually read through my permit copy carefully, turning it over once as if checking for something on the back, and asked, quietly, whether the county date stamp on the document was something the board could independently verify. Brenda answered before I could, saying the board would take the documentation under advisement, a phrase that told me, even before anything else happened that evening, exactly how much weight my carefully organized folder was actually going to carry in that room. I laid out the permit record, the listing photos, and a simple timeline showing the fence predated my ownership by 6 years. Brenda's response was the moment I understood exactly what kind of board I was actually dealing with. Ms. Castellano, our records show the violation notice was issued after your closing date, which makes it your responsibility as the current owner, regardless of who originally built the structure. That's standard HOA practice. Violations run with the property, not the person. I pointed out that a violation notice issued after my closing date for a structure that had existed and presumably been visible to the board for 6 full years before I ever arrived, raised an obvious question. Why had nobody cited the previous owner in 6 years, and why had the fine only appeared, freshly calculated with 11 months of accumulated daily penalties, right after a new owner, someone unfamiliar with the board's history, moved in? Brenda didn't have a good answer to that question, and I noticed, watching her carefully across that conference table, that she didn't seem especially bothered by not having one. The board's decision stands, she said, with the flat confidence of someone who'd delivered that exact sentence to a great many homeowners over 9 years, without anyone ever pushing back hard enough to make her reconsider. You're welcome to appeal in writing, but I'll tell you now, these appeals rarely succeed. I didn't want to spend the 18 months and $10,000 a real lawsuit against my own HOA would likely cost, not over $2,400, however unjustly assessed. So instead of hiring an attorney, I did something simpler. I submitted a formal written records request under the same Common Interest Community Act provision, this time asking for every architectural violation notice the association had issued over the preceding 3 years. Along with the corresponding dates each cited structure had first appeared on the property, information the association was legally required to maintain and disclose to any member who asked. It took Summit Ridge 6 weeks to comply, well past the 14 business days the statute actually allows, a delay I documented in writing each time I followed up, and Roland Prescott's office finally produced the records only after I mentioned, calmly and in writing, that I understood the statute to carry its own penalty provision for associations that failed to produce requested records within the mandated window. What those records showed, once I actually sat down with my son Peter one Saturday afternoon and went through 3 years of violation notices, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, was a pattern that had nothing to do with fair, even-handed enforcement, and everything to do with something else entirely. Of the last 31 violation notices issued, 26 had gone to homeowners who'd purchased their properties within the previous 12 months, cited for pre-existing structures that had, in every single case, existed under a previous owner's tenure for years without ever drawing a citation. New owners, it turned out, made for easy targets. They didn't know the community's informal history, didn't know which structures had always been there, and this was the part that made my stomach turn a little once I saw it laid out in Peter's spreadsheet. They were statistically far more likely to simply pay a fine rather than fight it, having just spent their savings on a down payment and having no appetite left for a dispute with their new neighborhood's governing body in their first year in a new home. Before I brought that spreadsheet back to the board, I spent the better part of 2 weekends actually calling the 26 homeowners whose names appeared in that pattern, introducing myself as a fellow resident who'd successfully fought a similar fine and wanted to understand whether others had experienced the same treatment. Most of the conversations followed a similar shape. A young couple 2 streets over, the Dela Cruzes, had paid a $1,800 fine for a shed that predated their purchase by 3 years, choosing to pay rather than fight it, because, as the wife told me over the phone, we'd just spent everything we had on the down payment, and the letter made it sound like we didn't have much choice. A retired Air Force veteran named Walter Higbee had paid $950 for a satellite dish installed by the previous owner, and told me he genuinely believed, reading the violation notice, that HOA fines simply worked that way everywhere, since it was his first time owning in a community with an association at all. Not one of the 26 I spoke with had thought to request the underlying permit history the way I had. Mostly, several admitted, because they hadn't known that was even something a homeowner could do, or because the process of requesting county records felt more intimidating than simply writing a check to make an unpleasant letter go away. That pattern of quiet, individual compliance is, I've come to understand since, exactly what makes an improperly enforced fine schedule so profitable and so difficult to catch in the first place. No single homeowner has much incentive to fight a few hundred, or even a couple $1,000s through a lengthy dispute process, especially not new owners still adjusting to an unfamiliar community and an unfamiliar governing body. It's only when you add up 26 of those individually reasonable decisions to simply pay and move on that the shape of something else entirely starts to emerge. I brought that spreadsheet to a second hearing, along with a formal demand that my fine be reversed, given the documented, undisputed 6-year gap between the fence's construction and any citation. This time, Brenda Wexford's confidence cracked just slightly, enough that I noticed it even if the other 2 board members present didn't seem to register anything unusual. "This is a pattern that predates my time reviewing individual files closely," she said, which was a strange thing to say for someone who'd chaired the architectural committee personally for the better part of a decade. The board voted, that same meeting, to reverse my fine in full, and Brenda added, almost as an afterthought, that the association would also be reviewing its enforcement procedures going forward. A vague commitment that, I noted at the time, cost her nothing and required nothing of her personally. I'd gotten my $2,400 back, which was the whole reason I'd started down this path in the first place. But I'd also uncovered something that bothered me a great deal more than my own fine ever had. A pattern of the association, systematically targeting its newest, most vulnerable members for revenue, over years, under a board president who either knew about it and allowed it, or hadn't been paying close enough attention to a community she'd governed for 9 years to notice it happening under her own signature. I mentioned as much to Peter on the drive home from that second hearing, and he asked a question that changed the direction of everything that followed. "Mom, if they're squeezing homeowners for a couple $1,000s at a time on fines that don't hold up, what do their actual finances look like? Have you ever seen a real audit of this HOA?" I hadn't. Neither. It turned out, had almost anyone else at Whispering Pines, in longer than anyone could remember. I thought that was the end of it. My fine reversed, my curiosity mostly satisfied. I was wrong. Brenda Wexford was never the only person with something to hide. Peter's question sent me back to the same records request statute I'd already used once, this time asking for the association's 3 most recent annual financial statements and reserve fund studies, documents every HOA is required to prepare periodically and disclose to members on request. What came back, again slower than the statute allowed, showed something that even I, with no accounting background beyond balancing my own checkbook for 4 decades, could see was strange. The community's reserve fund, money set aside specifically for major future repairs like roof replacement on the clubhouse, resurfacing the pool, repaving the community's internal roads, had declined by nearly 60% over 3 years, despite the association's own reserve study, commissioned from an outside engineering firm 5 years earlier, recommending steady annual contributions that should have grown the fund, not shrunk it. I mentioned this at the community's coffee social the following week, mostly making conversation, and a retired man named Arthur Kim, who I hadn't spoken with much beyond a friendly wave, got noticeably quiet before pulling me aside once the conversation moved elsewhere. Arthur, it turned out, had served as the HOA's volunteer treasurer for 4 years, ending about 18 months before I moved in, and he told me, in a low voice, that he'd resigned from the board specifically because he'd raised concerns about vendor billing from Summit Ridge that Brenda Wexford had dismissed every single time, eventually making his position on the board uncomfortable enough that he simply stopped running for re-election rather than keep fighting a battle nobody else on the board seemed willing to take seriously. He mentioned, almost as an aside, something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. Look into who actually owns Summit Ridge sometime. It's not exactly a secret, but nobody's ever bothered to ask out loud. That was the moment I understood my dog-run fence had been, in retrospect, the smallest and least interesting problem at Whispering Pines Estates. Arthur told me more over coffee the following week, once he'd decided, I think, that I wasn't going to simply let the reserve fund question drop the way most homeowners eventually did once their own individual grievance got resolved. He'd raised the vendor billing concern formally, in writing, during his third year as treasurer, after noticing that the landscaping contract's monthly invoices had crept up nearly 40% over 2 years, without any corresponding board vote approving a rate increase of that size. Brenda Wexford, he said, had told him at the time that Summit Ridge's rates reflected market conditions and that questioning a vendor relationship the board had already approved wasn't really the treasurer's role to second-guess. He'd pushed for an independent review anyway, been outvoted 3-2, and decided, the following year, that 4 years of being the lone skeptical voice on a 5-member board wasn't worth the toll it was taking on his relationship with neighbors he still had to see at the mailbox every day. "I'm not proud of walking away instead of pushing harder," he told me, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table between us. "I figured somebody eventually would look closer. I just didn't expect it to take this long, or to be a woman who'd lived here less than a year." A basic search of the state's business registration database, the kind of search anyone can run for free in about 10 minutes, confirmed what Arthur had implied without spelling out directly. Roland Prescott, the owner of Summit Ridge Community Management, was listed as an officer of the company alongside his wife, whose maiden name, cross-referenced against the HOA's own membership roster I already had access to as a homeowner, matched Brenda Wexford's listed sister. Brenda Wexford's brother-in-law ran the very management company her board had renewed, without competitive bidding, for 6 consecutive years. That relationship, on its own, wasn't necessarily improper. Plenty of small communities end up with overlapping social and professional connections without any wrongdoing involved. What made it worth pursuing further was what it suggested about why a board that had, by its own volunteer treasurer's account, been warned about questionable vendor billing 4 years earlier, had never once commissioned an independent review to check whether those concerns had merit. I called Peter again, and this time he offered to actually help, rather than just ask pointed questions from the sidelines. As a practicing CPA, he walked me through what an independent financial audit of an HOA typically looks for, and more importantly, he confirmed something I hadn't known. The state's Common Interest Community Act includes a provision allowing any percentage of members meeting a fairly modest threshold, 10% of the membership, in our case 31 signatures out of just over 300 homes, to formally petition the board to commission an independent financial audit, conducted by a CPA firm with no prior relationship to the association or its management company, with the results to be disclosed to the full membership regardless of what the audit found. Gathering 31 signatures in a gated community, where most people had never met their own next-door neighbors, sounded, at first, like the hardest part of this entire plan. It turned out to be one of the easiest, mostly because of the very pattern I'd already documented. I reached out first to the 26 homeowners whose violation notices had shown up in that skewed pattern of new owner fines, several of whom I'd never met, introducing myself simply as another homeowner who'd successfully fought a similar fine and wanted to know if others had experienced the same thing. 18 of them agreed almost immediately to sign a petition once I explained what I'd found, several sharing their own frustrated stories of paying fines they'd never fully understood or felt equipped to fight at the time. Between those 18 and a handful of longtime residents Arthur Kim quietly connected me with, people who'd shared his same unease for years without ever organizing around it, I had 34 signatures within 3 weeks, comfortably above the required threshold. I submitted the petition formally, in writing, citing the exact statutory provision, at the following month's board meeting, in front of a noticeably larger crowd than the association's meetings usually drew. Word travels fast in a small community, once people sense something is actually happening, rather than just being discussed abstractly. Brenda Wexford's response, delivered from the head of the table, with visibly less composure than she'd shown at either of my own hearings, was the line I still think about whenever I hear someone explain away a conflict of interest as no big deal. I don't think an independent audit is necessary, or a good use of association funds. Summit Ridge has managed this community successfully for 6 years, and I trust Roland's team completely. A homeowner in the third row, one of the 18 who'd signed my petition, asked the obvious follow-up question out loud before I even had the chance to, "Isn't Roland Prescott your brother-in-law?" The room went quiet, in a way that told me plenty of people had wondered the same thing privately, for years, without ever asking it in front of everyone. Brenda didn't deny the relationship. She couldn't. It was a matter of public record anyone could verify. But she insisted, with visible irritation, that it had no bearing on Summit Ridge's professional performance. Under the statute, though, her personal opinion about whether the audit was necessary didn't actually matter once the petition met the required threshold. The board was legally obligated to commission the audit regardless of whether its president wanted one, and after a tense 15 minutes of procedural back and forth that the association's own attorney, present that evening, eventually confirmed left the board no real discretion to refuse. The audit was approved 4 votes to 1, with Brenda casting the lone dissenting vote. Gathering those 34 signatures taught me something about Whispering Pines I hadn't expected to learn. A woman named Corazon Delphine, 3 doors down from a house I'd never had reason to visit before, invited me in for tea once I explained what the petition was for, and told me she'd been quietly paying an extra $40 a month in special landscaping assessment fees for over 2 years that she'd never fully understood, but had assumed, as a newer immigrant less familiar with how American homeowners associations typically operated, was simply a normal cost of living somewhere like Whispering Pines. She signed without hesitation and asked, almost shyly, whether the audit might also look into that specific charge. It did, eventually, and the auditors found no corresponding board resolution authorizing it at all, just an internal Summit Ridge billing code that had been quietly applied to a subset of accounts, for reasons nobody at the management company could later explain in writing. A retired police detective named Gary Ostrowski, one of the longtime residents Arthur connected me with, brought an entirely different kind of skepticism to the effort, one I found genuinely useful once the petition drive turned into the actual audit process. He insisted we keep a written log of every conversation, every signature, every date, the same way he said he'd have documented a case file during his career, because the first thing a defense attorney does is try to poke holes in your timeline, and these people are going to have a defense attorney eventually. Mark my words. That log turned out to matter more than I expected once Summit Ridge's own counsel, once retained, tried unsuccessfully to argue procedural irregularities in how the petition had been circulated, an argument the association's attorney dismantled easily, using exactly the documentation Gary had insisted we keep from the very beginning. The audit nearly didn't happen at all, and it's worth pausing on the moment it almost fell apart, because long, drawn-out fights like this one rarely move in a straight line toward the outcome you're hoping for. 3 weeks into Denise Farrow's review, once her firm's document requests had grown specific enough to make clear exactly which vendor contracts she was scrutinizing most closely, Summit Ridge's attorney sent a formal letter to the association's board, threatening to seek a court injunction halting the audit entirely, arguing that the scope of documents requested exceeded what the state statute actually authorized and constituted an improper fishing expedition orchestrated by a disgruntled minority of homeowners with a personal vendetta against the company. For about 4 days, until the association's own attorney reviewed the statute's language carefully and confirmed in writing that Denise Farrow's requests fell squarely within the disclosure obligations any HOA vendor is required to accept as a condition of doing business with a common interest community. I genuinely worried the entire effort might stall out in a procedural dispute neither side could quickly resolve. Arthur Kim, when I called him that week sounding more discouraged than I had in months, told me something that stuck with me for the rest of the fight. Roland's threatening a lawsuit over document requests because he can't threaten one over the actual numbers. That's not strength, Diane. That's the sound of someone running out of better options. He turned out to be exactly right. Summit Ridge's attorney never actually filed anything in court. and the audit proceeded on schedule once the 4-day standoff resolved in the association's favor. The audit took 11 weeks to complete, conducted by an independent CPA firm 2 counties over, with no prior relationship to Summit Ridge or anyone on the board. And the findings, when they finally arrived and were read aloud at a packed special meeting that drew more homeowners than I'd seen at any single Whispering Pines event in my 2 years there, were worse than even Arthur Kim, with all his lingering suspicion, had anticipated. Over the preceding 4 years, Summit Ridge had billed the association for landscaping and pool maintenance contracts at rates the auditors determined were, on average, 31% above documented market rates for comparable services in the region, with several specific invoices for emergency repairs that the auditors could find no corresponding work order, permit, or before and after documentation for at all. The auditor's conservative estimate of overbilled funds, after accounting for reasonable administrative fees the management contract did legitimately allow, came to just over $340,000, diverted from the association's operating and reserve accounts over 4 years. The same 4 years that had seen the reserve fund decline by 60%, despite a reserve study recommending it grow. Roland Prescott did not go down without attempting his own defense first, and it's worth describing what that looked like, since it tells you something about how these situations often play out before the numbers finally speak for themselves. 2 weeks before the audit findings were formally presented, once word had leaked that Denise Farrow's firm had requested 4 years of underlying vendor invoices, rather than just summary statements, Summit Ridge sent a lengthy memo to the board, obtained later through yet another records request, characterizing the coalition's audit petition as an unfortunate and legally questionable overreach by a small faction of homeowners, and warning, somewhat ominously, that an adversarial audit process could expose the association to unnecessary legal costs and vendor relationship damage that would ultimately harm all homeowners financially. Sandra Whitfield, the younger board member who'd quietly examined my permit copy months earlier, later told a reporter from the small local paper covering the story that the memo had been the moment she personally decided something was seriously wrong, since a management company confident in the accuracy of its own billing had no obvious reason to characterize a routine financial review as an attack. Roland himself requested a private meeting with Denise Farrow's firm before the audit concluded, offering, according to Denise's own account relayed to the board afterward, to walk through the invoices personally to save everyone time, an offer Denise declined in writing, citing standard independence requirements that prohibit an auditor from allowing the audited party to guide the review's methodology. That refusal, small as it seems in isolation, mattered a great deal once the findings came out, since it meant nobody could later claim the audit had been shaped or softened by any conversation with the very person whose billing practices were under scrutiny. The board terminated Summit Ridge's management contract the same night the audit results were presented, a vote that this time passed unanimously, including, notably, Brenda Wexford's own vote in favor of termination, delivered without the confidence she'd carried into every prior confrontation. The association's attorney filed a formal demand for restitution against Summit Ridge and Roland Prescott personally, given the scale and apparent intentionality the audit findings suggested, and within 2 months, facing the prospect of a civil suit his own company's audited numbers would make very difficult to defend against. And after his own attorney reportedly advised him that a jury shown Denise Farrow's 4-year invoice comparison would have very little sympathy for a management company billing its clients' own gated community relatives at above-market rates, Roland Prescott agreed to a settlement returning $265,000 to the association, not the full amount identified, but a substantial recovery secured without the association needing to fund a lengthy lawsuit itself, paid out of Prescott's business insurance and personal assets combined according to the settlement terms later disclosed to the membership. The special meeting where the audit findings were read aloud ran nearly 3 hours, well past the 90 minutes originally scheduled, because homeowner after homeowner stood up to ask their own version of the same question. How had this gone on for 4 years without anyone catching it sooner? The auditors, 2 careful, unflappable CPAs named Denise Farrow and her junior associate, walked through the invoice discrepancies methodically, comparing Summit Ridge's billed landscaping rates against 3 competing bids the auditors had independently solicited from comparable firms in the region. A step, Peter told me afterward, was standard practice specifically to prevent an audited party from later claiming the comparison rates were unfair or cherry-picked. Denise Farrow's closing comment, delivered in the flat, unemotional tone of someone who'd clearly delivered plenty of uncomfortable audit findings over a long career, was the line I heard repeated by at least a dozen different homeowners in the parking lot afterward. This isn't a bookkeeping error. Bookkeeping errors don't consistently favor the same vendor for 4 consecutive years. It felt, that night, like a genuine, complete victory. The fine reversed, the corrupt vendor exposed and terminated, real money recovered for the community. I went home and told Peter it was finally over. I was wrong about that too, in a way that mattered a great deal more than my own dog-run fence ever had. Buried in the same audit documentation, in an appendix, nobody at that packed special meeting had thought to read closely, amid the drama of the headline findings, sat a set of correspondence records between Roland Prescott's office and a limited liability company called Bellwood Development Partners, dated over the preceding 18 months. Peter, going through the full audit binder line by line a few days later out of simple thoroughness, noticed the correspondence referenced the Meadowbrook parcel repeatedly, alongside draft language for a proposed amendment to the association's governing documents that would authorize the board to convey a portion of underutilized common area by a simple majority board vote, rather than the supermajority membership vote the original governing documents actually required for disposing of common property. The commercial appraiser, a soft-spoken man named Elliot Marsh, who did occasional consulting work for Peter's accounting clients, walked me through his informal analysis over the phone one Sunday afternoon, pulling up recent sales of comparable undeveloped acreage with similar road frontage in 3 nearby counties. Road frontage on a county highway is worth a real premium, he explained, especially 40 acres of it, because it's the kind of parcel a commercial developer can actually do something with, not just another landlocked residential lot. His informal range, based on 5 comparable sales over the preceding 18 months, landed between $1.9 and $2.3 million, meaning the Bellwood offer sat somewhere between 35 and 45% below what the land could plausibly fetch from a genuine, arm's-length buyer. Elliot's assessment wasn't a formal appraisal. He was careful to say so explicitly, more than once. But it gave Peter and me more than enough to understand exactly how much value the association stood to simply give away if that sale ever closed. A further records request, this one for the association's correspondence log with any outside parties regarding real property transactions, confirmed what that draft amendment language had already suggested. Bellwood Development Partners had submitted an unsolicited offer to purchase all 40 acres of Meadowbrook Commons for $1.2 million, an amount that, once Peter and I had a local commercial appraiser friend of his take a quick, informal look at comparable undeveloped parcels in the area, sat well below what land in that location could plausibly fetch on the open market, especially given its road frontage along the county highway at its northern edge. Bellwood Development Partners, according to the same business registration database that had unmasked Roland Prescott's relationship to Brenda Wexford, listed a registered agent whose address matched a small office suite Roland Prescott's own management company had operated out of for years, and whose single listed manager, a woman named Corinne Alvarez, turned out, on closer checking, to be Roland Prescott's longtime business partner in an entirely unrelated real estate venture. The two of them had run together for over a decade. Gary Ostrowski, still keeping his careful log out of what he now admitted was as much genuine enjoyment as civic duty, ran his own records check on Corinne Alvarez and turned up something that added a final, uncomfortable layer to the whole picture. Bellwood Development Partners had been formed only 14 months earlier, with no development history, no completed projects, and no assets beyond the modest filing fees required to register the entity at all. The classic profile, Gary said, of a shell company created for exactly one transaction, rather than any ongoing business purpose. Its only activity on record, anywhere, was the unsolicited offer sitting in front of us for Meadowbrook Commons. The board had never disclosed this offer to the membership. The proposed governing document amendment lowering the vote threshold required to approve it had been quietly scheduled for a vote at the very next annual meeting, buried on the agenda under a bland heading that read simply, Governing Document Housekeeping Amendments. The kind of item most homeowners skim past without a second thought at any HOA meeting they've ever attended. I'll admit there was a stretch, sometime in that gap between the audit settlement and the moment Peter found the Bellwood correspondence, where I genuinely considered stopping. I'd gotten my tuna $400 back months earlier. I'd helped uncover a genuine fraud and recover $250,000 for a community I'd only lived in for 2 years. Peter gently suggested, during one of our regular calls, that I'd more than done my part and that the reconstituted board could reasonably be trusted to handle whatever came next, without me personally driving every single step of it. I remember sitting on my back porch one evening that week, looking out at the tree line that eventually gives way to the edge of Meadowbrook Commons, and feeling, for the first time since the whole thing started, genuinely tired of being the person who kept finding one more thing wrong. It was Arthur Kim, of all people, who talked me back into paying attention, mentioning almost in passing, during a call about something unrelated that he'd heard secondhand about, some kind of housekeeping amendment scheduled for the next annual meeting agenda. That single offhand comment was enough to send me back to the full audit binder one more time, and it's the only reason Peter ever found the Bellwood correspondence buried in that appendix at all. I want to be honest about how I felt reading that correspondence for the first time, sitting at my kitchen table with Peter on speakerphone from 90 minutes away. It wasn't outrage exactly, though outrage came later. It was the specific, cold clarity of finally understanding a whole shape that had only ever shown itself to me before in disconnected pieces. An unfair fine, a slow records request, an unusual reserve fund decline, a family relationship nobody had ever questioned out loud. All of it, it turned out, had been pointing at the same thing the entire time. A board president who needed the membership, distracted, compliant, and unlikely to read governing document amendments closely. Managing a community whose most valuable undeveloped asset, her own extended family, stood to quietly acquire for a fraction of its worth. The state's Common Interest Community Act, the same statute that had already given me the tools to force the records disclosure and the independent audit, also provided a mechanism for exactly this situation, a recall election, allowing members to remove one or more sitting board members before their term expired, triggered by a petition signed by a specified percentage of the membership, 25% in our state, meaning I'd need 78 signatures this time, well beyond the 31 I'd needed for the audit petition, and a considerably higher bar given how much more direct and personal a recall petition feels to sign compared to a request for financial transparency. I didn't do this alone, and I want to be clear about that, because by this point Arthur Kim, several of the 18 original petition signers, and a handful of homeowners I'd never met before that packed audit meeting had all become genuinely invested in seeing this through properly rather than just watching from the sidelines. We organized, informally, into what amounted to a homeowner coalition, splitting up the community by street to canvass door to door, explaining calmly and with documentation in hand exactly what the audit appendix and the Bellwood correspondence actually showed. Arthur, drawing on his own 4 years as treasurer, was particularly effective at explaining to skeptical neighbors why a below-market land sale mattered even to homeowners who'd never once set foot on Meadowbrook Commons themselves. A devalued, poorly sold community asset lowers every single property's underlying value, whether anyone ever personally uses the 40 acres in question or not. Corazon Delphin, the neighbor who'd first told me about her mysterious landscaping surcharge over tea, turned out to be one of our most effective canvassers once the recall drive began, going door to door specifically in the pockets of the community where English wasn't always the first language spoken at home, translating the audit findings and the Bellwood correspondence into terms that made the stakes plain, regardless of anyone's familiarity with American HOA governance. She told me, toward the end of that 5-week push, that she'd never once in her 11 years at Whispering Pines felt like her signature, or her vote, actually mattered to how the community was run, and that watching neighbors from every part of the development sign the same petition for the same clearly documented reason was, in her words, The first time this has felt like an actual community, instead of just a place where we all happen to pay the same company every month. We gathered 81 signatures within 5 weeks, comfortably above the 78 required, and submitted the recall petition formally, triggering a special membership meeting the statute required to be scheduled within 45 days, specifically to vote on removing Brenda Wexford, along with 2 other board members whose votes on the proposed governing document amendment and their apparent knowledge of the Bellwood correspondence made their continued service equally untenable in the coalition's eyes. Brenda Wexford did not go quietly. In the weeks leading up to the special meeting, she sent a mailer to every homeowner, at the association's own expense, we later confirmed, a detail that became its own small controversy once discovered, characterizing the recall effort as a small group of disgruntled homeowners spreading misinformation about a legitimate real estate opportunity that could actually lower everyone's dues. The mailer itself, which I still have a copy of tucked into the same manila folder I'd once brought to my own hearing, ran nearly 2 full pages, printed in the association's official newsletter format, and made its case with a confidence that read, on a second pass, like someone who genuinely believed the numbers would work out however she needed them to. Meadowbrook Commons cost this association approximately $38,000 annually in insurance, mowing, and liability exposure. It read, money that could instead reduce every homeowner's dues by nearly $125 per year if the Bellwood proposal moves forward as planned. It made no mention of the $1.2 million sale price. No mention of the appraised value Peter's contact had estimated at closer to $2.1 million for comparable road frontage acreage in the area, and certainly no mention of Corinne Alvarez's business history with Roland Prescott. It was, technically, not a single outright lie. It was simply a very carefully incomplete picture, assembled by someone who understood that most homeowners would read a mailer about dues reduction far more closely than they'd ever read a business registration filing. She held an informal gathering at the clubhouse, attended by a noticeably smaller crowd than the Recall Coalition's own door-to-door canvassing had generated interest for, where she argued that Meadowbrook Commons was an underutilized liability, costing the association money in liability insurance and mowing costs that the Bellwood sale would eliminate entirely, while funding a significant dues reduction for every homeowner. It was, I'll grant her, a more sophisticated argument than anything she'd offered at either of my own hearings, and for a few uncomfortable days I genuinely worried it might work on enough undecided homeowners to save her position. What ultimately answered that argument wasn't anything the coalition manufactured ourselves. It was a simple side-by-side comparison, prepared by Peter and the same commercial appraiser friend who'd first flagged the below-market price, showing exactly how much below fair market value the Bellwood offer actually sat, alongside a clear explanation of who stood behind the shell company making that lowball offer. We printed that comparison as our own mailer, funded out of our own pockets rather than the association's treasury, a distinction several homeowners specifically thanked us for once they noticed it, and distributed it door to door the week before the special meeting. The special meeting itself drew nearly 200 homeowners, by far the largest turnout in the community's history, according to Arthur, who'd sat through plenty of thinly attended annual meetings during his own years on the board. Brenda Wexford made her case one final time, calmly, but with an edge of desperation that hadn't been present in her voice during either of my own hearings, and then the vote proceeded by the secret written ballot the statute required. Before the votes were even fully tallied, Brenda Wexford's attorney, the same firm I later learned that had represented Summit Ridge during the audit dispute, a connection nobody on the coalition found especially surprising by that point, raised a formal objection to the ballot count, arguing that 11 ballots submitted by homeowners who'd purchased their properties within the preceding 90 days should be disqualified on the theory that the association's bylaws required a minimum residency period before a member's vote could count toward a recall specifically, as opposed to a standard board election. It was a creative argument, and for about 20 tense minutes in that packed clubhouse hall, with 200 homeowners waiting to hear whether their own community's leadership had just been decided or not, the outcome felt genuinely uncertain. The association's attorney, flipping quickly through the actual bylaws with the kind of practice speed that comes from having read a document many times before, found the relevant section within a few minutes, and read it aloud to the room. The residency restriction Brenda's attorney had cited applied only to eligibility to serve as a candidate for the board, not to a member's underlying right to vote on any association matter, recall included. The objection was overruled on the spot. The 11 contested ballots were counted, and as it happened, they wouldn't have changed the outcome even if every single one had gone against the recall, a fact the room seemed to collectively exhale over once the final tally was announced. The recall passed with 74% of votes cast in favor of removing all 3 targeted board members, well above the simple majority the statute demanded, and the 2 remaining board members, facing a membership that had just delivered an unmistakable message, voted that same night to formally reject the proposed governing document amendment, lowering the common area sale threshold, and to rescind any consideration of the Bellwood Development Partners offer entirely. That should have been the end of it. And for most communities facing this kind of situation, it likely would have been. But the association's new interim leadership, seeking legal advice on how to fully close out the matter, learned something that complicated a clean resolution. Bellwood Development Partners, in the weeks before the recall vote, anticipating exactly this kind of pushback, had recorded a memorandum of option against the Meadowbrook Commons parcel at the County Register of Deeds, a legal document that, while not a completed sale, created a cloud on the association's title, potentially binding the association to honor the option's terms if Bellwood chose to exercise it within its stated 18-month window, regardless of the board's subsequent vote to reject the deal. The newly reconstituted board, with my full support and Peter's continued help navigating the financial and procedural details, authorized the association's attorney to file a quiet title action against Bellwood Development Partners, seeking a judicial determination that the recorded option was invalid on the grounds that it had been executed by board members acting outside their legal authority. Since the governing documents, even under Brenda Wexford's proposed but ultimately rejected amendment, had never actually taken effect, meaning the supermajority membership vote requirement for common area disposition had remained in force the entire time the option was signed, a requirement the outgoing board had never even attempted to satisfy before recording it. Bellwood's attorney, once the quiet title action was filed, tried a different tactic than anyone had anticipated, arguing in a preliminary motion that the association itself was estopped from challenging the option's validity because the board's own attorney had been present at the meeting where the option was authorized and had raised no formal objection at the time. Peter, sitting in on that hearing with me out of what had become genuine investment in seeing this through to the end, pointed out afterward that the association's attorney at that earlier meeting had represented the board as it existed before the recall, not the reconstituted board bringing the current action, and that in any case, an attorney's silence in the room didn't cure a substantive legal defect in the board's underlying authority to act. The judge agreed, denying Bellwood's motion to dismiss, and allowing the case to proceed to a full hearing on the merits, a ruling that took the wind out of Bellwood's legal strategy considerably, according to the association's own attorney, who told the reconstituted board afterward that Bellwood's team had clearly been hoping for an early, procedural win rather than a fight over the actual facts. The quiet title action took just over 8 months to resolve, a timeline the association's attorney had warned us was realistic from the outset, given how these actions typically proceed through the court's calendar, and the judge's ruling, when it finally came down, was unambiguous. The recorded option was void from its inception, having been executed without the authority the governing documents required, and Bellwood Development Partners held no enforceable interest whatsoever in the Meadowbrook Commons parcel. The judge's written opinion noted, with what I read as a certain dry disapproval, that a real estate transaction structured specifically to close before an ordinary membership vote could meaningfully object to it bore all the hallmarks of an arrangement designed to evade rather than comply with an association's own governance requirements. Gary Ostrowski's log, the one he'd kept out of old habit from his detective days, ended up being formally entered into the court record during the quiet title proceeding, cited by the association's attorney as clear. contemporaneous documentation of exactly when the membership had first learned of the Bellwood offer, and how promptly the community had organized against it once it did, a detail the judge's written opinion referenced approvingly when addressing Bellwood's argument that the association had somehow slept on its rights. Gary told me afterward, with the particular satisfaction of a man whose old instincts had finally been vindicated in a courtroom one more time, that it was the first case file he'd built in 11 years of retirement, and that it felt better than he expected it to. Meadowbrook Commons remains exactly what it was deeded to be, 40 acres of green space at the back of Whispering Pines Estates, walked most mornings now by considerably more homeowners than ever bothered before all of this started, several of whom, Arthur Kim tells me with some satisfaction, make a point of mentioning to newer residents exactly why that particular piece of land matters, and exactly how close the community came to losing it. The reconstituted board hired a new management company after a competitive bidding process involving 3 firms, none of them with any family connection to a single board member, and instituted a policy, formally adopted at the following annual meeting, requiring any proposed sale, lease, or encumbrance of common area to be posted publicly and explained in plain language at least 60 days before any vote, along with an annual independent financial review going forward, regardless of whether any member ever petitions for one again. I sat in on that bidding process myself, as an interested homeowner rather than a board member at that point, and it struck me how different the whole exercise felt from anything Whispering Pines had done in at least the 6 years Summit Ridge had held the contract uncontested. Each of the 3 competing firms presented detailed vendor cost breakdowns, references from at least 4 other communities of comparable size, and, this was the requirement Gary Ostrowski specifically insisted the board add to the request for proposals, drawing once more on his old instinct for closing procedural loopholes before they could be exploited. A signed disclosure statement confirming no officer, employee, or immediate family member of any officer held any financial or familial relationship with any current board member. The firm the board eventually selected, a mid-sized company that already managed 2 other communities in the county, came in with a bid nearly 18% below what Summit Ridge had been charging. Not because the new firm was cutting corners, the board's finance committee confirmed after checking references, but simply because Summit Ridge's rates had never actually reflected fair market pricing in the first place. Sandra Whitfield, the young board member who'd quietly questioned my permit copy back at my very first hearing, ended up giving a full, on-record interview to the local paper once the recall and the quiet title ruling were both finalized, explaining from the inside exactly how a 5-member volunteer board with the best intentions on paper could still end up rubber-stamping years of decisions nobody had individually verified, simply because verifying things took time. Nobody serving as an unpaid volunteer particularly had to spare. Her interview ran under a headline that made Arthur laugh out loud when he read it to me over the phone. How a $2,400 fence fine uncovered a $500,000 HOA scandal. I told him the number in the headline wasn't quite right, since the total between the audit recovery and the value of the preserved land ran considerably higher than that, and he said the reporter probably just liked the alliteration better than the accuracy. Brenda Wexford, for her part, sold her house at Whispering Pines about 8 months after the recall and moved out of state, according to the same closing records anyone can look up at the county office if they're curious, a departure nobody on the reconstituted board commented on publicly, and one I never felt the need to comment on either. Roland Prescott's settlement funds, combined with a modest special assessment the reconstituted board determined was still necessary to fully restore the reserve fund to the level its own 5-year-old study had always recommended, brought the association's finances back to health within about 14 months, and the clubhouse roof, which the original reserve study had flagged as needing replacement, finally got replaced that same year, on schedule, and within the newly restored reserve fund's actual budget, rather than through another emergency special assessment. Corazon Delphin's mysterious landscaping surcharge, the one she'd mentioned so shyly over tea that first afternoon, was refunded in full to every account it had ever been applied to, going back the full 2 years the auditors could document, a detail the new board made a point of announcing publicly, specifically because Corazon had never felt comfortable raising it loudly herself. She told me at the following spring's annual meeting, holding her refund check with what I can only describe as quiet vindication, that it was the first time in 11 years at Whispering Pines she'd felt like the association actually worked for people like her, rather than around them. Walter Higbee, the retired Air Force veteran who'd paid $950 for a satellite dish he never should have been fined for, got his money back too, along with a formal written apology from the reconstituted board, something none of the 26 original overcharged homeowners had ever received under Brenda Wexford's tenure, despite years of individually valid grievances. He told me he framed the apology letter, half joking, because after 30 years in the service, I never once got a written apology from anybody for anything, and I figured this one was worth keeping. I ran for the board myself the following spring, mostly at Arthur Kim's encouragement, and mostly, if I'm honest, because I'd come to genuinely care what happened to Meadowbrook Commons, and to a community I'd only lived in for 2 years before any of this started. I won a seat with the largest vote total of any candidate that election, and Peter still jokes that his mother, the retired librarian who spent 31 years quietly stamping due dates on library cards, turned out to be the most effective forensic investigator Whispering Pines Estates ever produced, purely by refusing to just pay a $2,400 fine that wasn't hers to pay. I never set out to take down an entire board. I just wanted $11 worth of county records to prove a fence I never built wasn't my fine to pay. And it turned out that was exactly enough thread to unravel everything else they'd been counting on, nobody ever pulling. Would you have just paid the fine and moved on? Or is it worth pulling the thread on every HOA fine that doesn't quite add up, even when it seems easier just to write the check? Let me know in the comments below. This video is a dramatized storytelling narrative based on real-life themes and HOA/property regulations. Names, characters, and specific locations are fictional or have been changed for privacy. Visuals are generated using AI tools for illustrative purposes only. This content is for entertainment purposes and does not constitute legal advice.